In the underworld where power hides in shadows and cash changes hands in silence, one man stood apart. He wove a network of influence that spanned cities, industries and borders. He built an empire not simply on fear or violence, but on the ruthless application of business-like precision, the hiding of money, the leveraging of legitimate enterprises, and the exploitation of legal loopholes. He rose from modest beginnings to become known as the richest mobster of his time, a figure whose name struck fear, commanded respect, and stirred both fascination and revulsion in equal measure. He was born into a world that offered little for the children of the working class. The neighborhoods he grew up in were scarred by poverty, crime, prostitution, illicit liquor, abandoned factories. He watched his parents work long hours, saw the hunger in the eyes of neighbors whose paychecks vanished on rent and debt. At a young age he realized that the rules of the street were different from the rules of the boardroom. The hustlers, the small-time loan sharks, the numbers runners, the racketeers, they played by a code he quickly learned. Loyalty above all, secrecy always, make the money flow and let no paper trail lead back to you. He began with small operations, extorting local businesses, offering protection to shops that otherwise would be flattened by rivals, running gambling dens in back rooms, turning a corner bar into a front for rackets. With every dollar he extracted, every risk he took, he sharpened his sense of scale. He asked himself, why confine myself to a few city blocks when entire industries lay open to corruption? Why operate a small bookmaking outfit when union contracts, airport trucking, construction kickbacks, and tax fraud schemes could yield far larger gains? As he climbed, he forged alliances with other criminal networks, merging the classic street gang methods with corporate-style sophistication. He placed trusted lieutenants in key positions, some in legitimate enterprises, others hidden behind shell corporations and offshore accounts. He used the law as a tool. He paid lawyers, prosecutors, judges, police, in ways that made investigations stall, evidence vanish, witnesses change their minds. He embedded his crews into unions, infiltrated contract bidding, forced businesses to pay for labor peace in order to avoid disruption. His fortune exploded. At the apex of his power, he controlled rackets across cities, states and sometimes countries. From narcotics to gambling, from construction to waste management, from import-export to tax fraud, his operations were interlinked. The legitimate side grew too. Companies that bid for municipal contracts, trucking fleets that looked ordinary but moved contraband, real estate holdings that laundered illicit cash into visible assets. He owned mansions, luxury cars, vacation properties, but always with one eye on the shadows. A mansion wasn't just a trophy, it was a node in a laundering network, a meeting place, a hideaway. Thanks to those structures he hid in his wealth. By using anonymous shell companies, trusts in offshore jurisdictions, fake invoices, unreported cash flows, he ensured most of his empire remained invisible to regulators. He hired accountants and lawyers who specialized in pushing the envelope of legality. He created layers of ownership such that even if the authorities caught one piece, they could never trace the whole. He invested in industries where cash dominated, where bookkeeping was lax, where regulation was weak. He knew the audit trail would dry up long before investigators got to the real source. Despite this, he always lived with risk. The law encroached. The press sniffed. Rivals rose. Inside his own organization, ambition simmered. He was paranoid, but also pragmatic. He avoided the flamboyance of his predecessors who put themselves in limelight. He rarely attended events with cameras, rarely gave interviews, seldom used his real identity for business deals. Yet his reputation preceded him. In whisper networks of businessmen, politicians and gangsters alike, his name invited a chill. When the authorities finally caught onto one of his major operations, it was often not the root rackets but the paper trails that brought him down, or rather, the absence of them. A tax fraud scheme, a false bookkeeping entry, a shell corporation that couldn't produce its own records. A corrupt official flipped. Witnesses entered witness protection and began talking. The system that he had manipulated so well began to squeeze. Simultaneously, internal pressure mounted, lieutenants who felt underpaid, crews who thought they could do better by flipping or competing independently. The downfall didn't happen overnight. Like all empires built on sand, cracks appeared. There were close calls, raids that netted only minor players, indictments that failed for lack of evidence, his legal team buying time. But each close call cost money and drew attention. The empire needed renewals, new fronts, new money laundering channels, fresh bribes. The cost of staying invisible rose. And eventually, one key operation collapsed. Maybe a shipment intercepted, maybe a union boss arrested, maybe a trusted lieutenant arrested and flipped. Once that happened, law enforcement seized the opportunity. Faced with mounting charges and the threat of long prison sentences, he weighed his options. Some choose to flee, he tried to hide in plain sight, staying in one of his mansions under a false name, trusting his network to buy time. But wiretaps, undercover agents, forensic accountants combined. The government moved in. The trial was long, drawn out, sensational. The press referred to him as the richest mobster, with billions at stake. His attorneys fought hard, but the evidence, once gathered, was overwhelming. In the courtroom, he sat impassive. He still wore fine suits, though the bulk of his wealth was frozen. Witnesses testified. Shell companies were exposed. Bank accounts traced to him via proxies. The jury deliberated. He was convicted on multiple counts: racketeering, conspiracy, tax fraud, extortion. Sentenced to a long stretch behind bars. His assets were seized, his businesses dismantled. Yet even in prison he remained a symbol of the possibilities of crime, of the danger of organized power outside the law. He had built an empire that looked like a Fortune 500 firm, rivaled legitimate corporations in size and reach. He had corrupted unions, manipulated markets, bribed officials, laundered money through continents. He became a case study in how organized crime had transformed from street gangs to corporate-style enterprises. His legacy is complicated. On one hand, he inflicted enormous harm. His rackets destroyed businesses, corrupted public institutions, exploited workers, trafficked contraband, traded in violence and intimidation. On the other hand, his story reveals the intersections between crime and capitalism, how the logic of profit, secrecy, scale, diversification, and investment can be applied in the underworld just as in the legitimate world. Today his empire is gone, but the techniques he pioneered live on. Law enforcement agencies now organize task forces, multilateral agencies, financial crime units that trace the flow of money rather than simply chase guns and drugs. Regulations have tightened, banks file suspicious activity reports, shell companies face more scrutiny. Yet criminals adapt. The game changes. The richest mobster of his era may no longer be active, but his shadow remains. When historians assess his place in the dark annals of organized crime, they note that while precise figures are impossible to confirm, estimates of his net worth at the height of his power ran into the hundreds of millions if not billions. In the underreported world of illegal enterprise, certainty is elusive. Some of the richest gangsters in history include individuals whose fortunes were estimated at $30 billion, though these include drug cartel leaders outside the traditional mafia structure. Within the American-Italian mafia scene, the man we have been describing stood out because of his control of multiple rackets, use of white-collar methods, and the scale of his hidden empire. His story also serves as warning. The cost of unchecked criminal enterprise is borne by society: corrupt institutions, weakened rule of law, businesses unwilling to invest in jurisdictions flagged by risk, citizens vulnerable to extortion, unions used as instruments of crime rather than representation, the public paying higher costs for services because of inflated contracts. When a mobster operates like a corporate titan, the damage is systemic. Finally, his personal story is human too. The thrills of power, the paranoia of betrayal, the isolation of someone who cannot trust even his closest associates. The dinners in luxury, the flights on private jets, the safe houses across continents. But also the constant fear of arrest, the anxiety of hidden cameras, the sleepless nights counting bribes, the stress of keeping that empire alive. When it collapsed, he lost the freedom, the fortune, the friends, the fear and respect he commanded. Behind bars, he reflected on what he'd built and what it cost. In the end, the title of Richest Mobster is fitting not simply for the size of the fortune, but for what it reveals: how organized crime adapted to the modern era, how the underworld borrowed from legitimate business, how secrecy became as important as violence, how globalization and finance offered new avenues for corruption and laundering, how the rule of law must evolve to keep pace. His name may fade from headlines, but the lessons remain. In boardrooms and courtrooms, in task forces and regulatory agencies, in city permits and union negotiations, the ripple effects of his empire still ripple outward. Crime, after all, is not just about bullets and blood. It is about money, about influence, about the networks beneath the networks. He mastered that. He became the richest mobster. And his story is a chapter in the ongoing struggle between law and lawlessness, between profit and principle, between the visible and the invisible.